A hospital after that ban came into effect last night who were turned back at roadblocks. It didn't stop up to 5,000 people from getting to Tahrir Square, though. As we were walking there with the protesters, we saw streams of people coming from all directions in the city. They had walked for hours, and they all congregated in the same place. Many of them ending up on that very short stretch of the bridge protected by riot police, whose main job seemed to be to actually protect the bridge and access to the green zone. Shuli?
Jane, thanks very much indeed for that. Jane Araf in Baghdad there.
Thank you.
Well, you're watching Al Jazeera. Let's remind you of the day's main developments as protests continue around the Middle East this Friday. Thousands have been rallying in eastern Libyan cities controlled by Gaddafi's opponents. They're supporting protesters in Tripoli who were fired on by troops and militia loyal to the Libyan leader. In Iraq, as you've been hearing, growing frustration over food, water, electricity and job shortages has boiled over during a day of rage. Several have died in clashes between protesters and security forces around the country. In Egypt, people are keeping up the pressure on their military rulers with tens of thousands back out in the square in Cairo demanding quicker reforms. And protests against Yemen's president have spread to towns and cities around the country, with deaths reported at a rally in Aden. Now back to Libya, where the revolt has triggered a mass of evacuations of foreign nationals. China has sent a Navy ship to protect citizens leaving Libya. Beijing says a missile frigate has been diverted from anti-piracy duties in the Gulf of Aden to escort ships carrying Chinese evacuees. And 2 planes sent by the Chinese government have touched down safely in Beijing. They were carrying more than 250 Chinese nationals. More than 30,000 Chinese workers were believed to be in Libya when fighting broke out. Some 12,000 have since left. Relief in Athens, where Greek nationals have been safely airlifted home from Tripoli. Most described scenes of chaos in the Libyan capital. One said he witnessed what he called 4 cold-blooded executions in the streets. And a group of UN workers evacuated from Tripoli has arrived in a military airport outside Rome. They include Italians and other European Union citizens. They were flown back on 2 Italian military transport planes mobilized by the country's foreign ministry emergency unit. And of course, there are hundreds, thousands of people flooding out across the borders of Libya into neighbouring countries. Let's speak to Antonio Guterres, the UN's High Commissioner for Refugees, who joins us from Geneva. Thank you very much indeed for speaking with us. Thousands fleeing Libya. Just how serious is the refugee situation?
Well, for the moment, we had about 40,000 people crossing both the Tunisian border and the Egyptian border. The large majority are Tunisian citizens and Egyptian citizens going back to their countries of origin. But we are having some Libyans crossing too, and we are having also nationals from other countries. And what we are very, very much worried about is with the fact that a lot of people are trapped inside the area of Tripoli. They cannot escape, and we are witnessing a carnage. We are witnessing a terrible bloodshed, and in the worst affected areas there is not even a possibility to flee. We also know of Libyans that tried to cross the border into Tunisia, and the Libyan forces around the border were still controlled by the government, not allowing them to flee. So that is indeed a big concern for us, is that people are suffering horribly, and those that are really suffering horribly are not being able to flee, and we have not the capacity to assist them.
We're also hearing reports that black Africans who are living in Libya are now afraid of going out of their homes for fear of being mistaken for the black mercenaries that Gaddafi is using. Are you hearing similar reports?
Yes, it's absolutely true. Unfortunately, there are a certain number of mercenaries and many innocent people that were working in Libya are being targeted and feel threatened because of this confusion. We have witnessed also, namely the Egyptian border, people coming from different African countries, and they were channeled by the Egyptian authorities to the embassies of the countries. And we are naturally very attentive to the possible crossing of refugees coming from countries where they cannot go back because they might be persecuted in their own countries, to make sure sure that there is a solution for them. And I would like to make an appeal to, if I may make an appeal to the international community. I think it's very important to give massive support to Egypt and to Tunisia. The people and the government of these two countries are showing an enormous generosity, opening the borders and accepting everybody. They need support from the international community, and I hope that the international community will be able to mobilize that support. In between, unfortunately, we are not able to do anything in Libya because of the dramatic security situation there. But at least in Tunisia and in Egypt, we need a lot of international support.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about what kind of support those countries are getting. Also about the concerns from European countries like Malta or Italy that they could be inundated by refugees from Libya. How are you addressing that?
Well, I think that first of all we need to be concerned with the Libyan people that is suffering, that the Libyans that are being killed in this terrible disaster. Then I think to recognize that the burden is now essentially in Tunisia and in Egypt. Of course, there is a possibility of people going into Europe, and if that is the case, I'm confident that Europe will honor its obligations and international law, that borders will also be open, and the people will be able to be granted protection if they are fleeing conflict and they come into the European soil.
There is, of course, a debate now going on amongst international communities about what best to do about the situation in Libya. How important is it, do you think, that they reach consensus quickly?
Well, we are a humanitarian agency. I'm not allowed to express my own political opinion, but I have to say that my heart feels very oppressed when I see this carnage going on and when I see the inability of the international community to stop it.
It's very good to speak with you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Antonio Guterres, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees there.
Thank you very much.
So protests taking place across the Middle East, not just Libya. These are pictures coming out of Cairo. If you thought the protests there were over as soon as Mubarak left, then you'd be wrong. These people out in force again, ironically 1 month on, 25th of February, marking the month on from when the protests began in Cairo to remove Hosni Mubarak. These people out because reforms not moving quick enough. Shireen Tadros joins me live from Cairo. Shireen, what do these people want?
Simply put, they're not happy with the new caretaker government, not necessarily because of anything that they've already done or are yet to do, but because of the composition of the government. They feel that Ahmed Shafiq, who's the prime minister, was handpicked by Hosni Mubarak, the previous president, the man that they worked so hard to get out. He was handpicked, and then he picked all the other ministers. So they don't trust this government in general. They're also unhappy with other specific ministers. The foreign minister, who has been there since Mubarak's rule. They're not happy with the justice minister, who they say is behind the vote rigging in the previous election. So this is not a government that they feel will really enact the kind of changes that these people desperately want.
I was also reading that a fair significant proportion of them want to see Mubarak put on trial for what he's done. What are you hearing about that?
Yes, exactly. I mean, they have a list of demands at the moment, but one of them is to deal with Hosni Mubarak. They don't feel like him stepping down is the end of the story, and they're not happy specifically with the fact that Mubarak and his family are still in the country, reportedly in Sharm el-Sheikh. They think that that may ruin the revolution. So there's a big, right now, there's a big drive by the Egyptian prosecutor general for those of the old regime, including Mubarak, to have some kind of accountability for their assets to be frozen. We did indeed see the Mubarak's international assets frozen in banks in France and Switzerland, but it's not enough for the protesters, the demonstrators, and really the Egyptian population at large who want to see Mubarak face some kind of trial or at least be held accountable for his 30 years of rule here.
One positive development that came out of all those protests that we saw over the last few weeks was a unity between Muslims and Christians. Is that still the case now?
Yes, it definitely is. I mean, what we were seeing just prior to the revolution was real sectarian differences in terms of what was happening between the Coptic minority here and the Muslim majority, and what the real success story of the revolution was, and what we were reporting on at the time, was this unity that we saw between the two communities during the revolution. They were united behind this main aim to get rid of Hosni Mubarak, and many people were afraid that once that main aim was met, we would start seeing sectarian strife again. And although in the last few weeks we have seen a few pockets of that, especially in Upper Egypt in the last few days, a lot of people here want to send the message that that is simply incitement by the police, and that really the Muslims and the Christians here are still hand in hand in this revolution, and they're still very much united in its main aim.
Shireen in Cairo, thank you very much indeed. So let's just take you through the main developments from this day of protest, so-called day of anger throughout the Middle East. Friday prayers in Libya have turned into mass rallies against Muammar Gaddafi. In eastern cities controlled by his opponents, thousands marched in support of protesters in Tripoli, who've been fired on by troops and militia. In Iraq, protests over corruption and a lack of basic services and jobs have turned violent. Several have died in clashes with the security forces around the country. And as you've been hearing, exactly a month after they started the protests which ousted President Mubarak, Egyptians are back in Cairo's Liberation Square. They're demanding quicker reforms from their military rulers. They want the lifting of the emergency law, for example. And in Yemen, tens of thousands of supporters and opponents of the president have held rival rallies in Sana'a. Anti-government protests have also been staged around the country. Now, the leading figures in NATO are gathering to talk about how the organisation should respond to the uprising and the treatment of protesters in Libya. Let's go to Stephen Cole in London for the latest on that. Stephen.
Thanks, Shirley. The questions being asked of the world's biggest military alliance are tough ones. Whether there should be an armed intervention to stop the violence, and also whether or not NATO planes should police a no-fly zone over Libya. Well, Tim Friend is outside that meeting in the Belgian capital, Brussels. So, Tim, what action, if any, is NATO likely to take?
Well, they're saying that they're not, at least officially, discussing, or at least they haven't so far, the idea of a no-fly zone. I think it would present them with certain dilemmas. They don't want to escalate an already obviously volatile situation. But there is increasing pressure for such an idea, because obviously it would have the effect of preventing Gaddafi, Colonel Gaddafi, from using his own air power against his own